I'm going to be talking about cognitive load theory. The theory is an instructional theory which is based on our knowledge of human cognition, how we learn, how we think, how we solve problems. And I'll be spending most of this talk, I'll talk for about 25, 30 minutes, I guess. I'll be spending most of this talk talking about human cognitive architecture. Human cognitive architecture is concerned with how we learn, how we think, how we solve problems. It concerns the structures and procedures of our cognitive system. So let's dive into human cognitive architecture. The first issue that we need to consider is categories of knowledge. We can categorize knowledge in an infinite number of ways. And most of the ways in which we can categorize knowledge don't really have instructional implications. But there is one categorization scheme that was revealed to us by David Geary, which imposes two categories of knowledge, and these have profound implications for instruction. The first category of knowledge he calls biologically primary knowledge. Now, biologically primary knowledge is knowledge we have evolved to acquire over countless generations. We acquire it easily and, in most cases, unconsciously, without difficulty. Much of that knowledge is very, very complicated, but we don't have any difficulty assimilating and learning that information. I'll give you some examples. Probably the best example is learning to listen to and speak your native language. So in your case, learning to listen to and speak Spanish, you didn't really ever need to be taught that. You simply had to grow up in a Spanish society, and by growing up in a Spanish society, you easily, automatically, unconsciously learn to listen and speak Spanish. You can see what I mean when I talk about something like speaking. Unless you're a speech pathologist, most of us would not have any idea how to teach somebody how to organize their lips, their tongue, their mouth, their voice, their breath in order to speak. It's an immensely complicated skill. People don't go to school, though. There's no school subject which says, this is how you speak. It's much more complicated than most of the things we learn in school, but we have evolved to acquire our first language as a biologically primary skill, one that we have evolved to acquire. There are other biologically primary skills, general problem-solving skill. Most of us can't name our general problem-solving skills, but we engage in general problem-solving all the time. And again, that's sometimes they try to teach it, but it's a waste of time trying to teach it because we acquire it easily, automatically, unconsciously ourselves. So they're biologically primary skills. They're very important to us. They're what make us humans. but we don't need to teach them. We'll learn them, but we'll learn them automatically. Cognitive load theory is mainly concerned with biologically secondary skills. Biologically secondary skills are different from primary skills. They're different in the sense that our culture determines which of those skills we have to learn, which of those skills we have to acquire. And we acquire them consciously, with effort, and in most cases, we need to be taught how to acquire them. Again, I'll use a language example. I mentioned before that when we learn to listen and speak, we do it automatically without being taught. We don't learn to read and write automatically without being taught. Humans have been able to listen and speak as long as there were humans. Most people haven't been able to read and write until, what, 100, 150 years ago? It's relatively recent. We invented reading and writing 5,000 years ago, but for most of that period, until mass education started, the vast majority of any population could not read and write. Now, the reason I want to emphasize that is there's about, at least in some countries, for the last 2 generations, there's been an emphasis on what's sometimes been called natural learning. People have said things like, look how easy it is to learn things in the outside world, which are not being taught. Look how hard it is to learn things in schools and educational establishments. And they've said, we are doing it all wrong in schools. We ought to have people learn naturally, to just put them in the correct environment and they will learn automatically, just as we do outside. That has been, at least to some extent, instituted in many countries, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for the very good reason that the difference between how we learn in the outside world and how we learn in education is not just a difference in the way the information is presented, it's different information. It's different information in that some of the information is biologically primary, and we don't need to set up schools for that. We have set up schools precisely and directly in order for people to learn biologically secondary information, which otherwise they would not learn. So the first major point I want to make is schools are there to assist people in acquiring biologically secondary information. And so it's mainly biologically secondary information that we are concerned with when we're concerned with education. We need to consider the cognitive architecture that's associated with the acquisition of biologically secondary information. So let's talk about that now. There are 2 ways we can acquire information. two ways we can acquire biologically secondary information, and both of those two ways are themselves biologically primary. So one way is to do exactly what we're doing now, and that's to obtain information from another person. Now, you can obtain information from another person by listening to what they say, which is what we're doing now, or by reading what they write, or by imitating what they do. It's a very efficient way, an extremely efficient way of obtaining information, and it's probably, at least in part, explains the reason why humans are the dominant mammalian species on Earth. Our ability to communicate information to each other, it's unrivaled. There's no other species that can do it in the way in which we do it. But we have a second way of obtaining information. And we need to have a second way because sometimes we need to get information. We need to obtain information, and there's nobody available to provide that information for us. Either nobody has that information, or other people may have that information, but we don't have access to those other people at a given time. And that second way is by problem solving. Our ability to solve problems, just like our ability to obtain information from other people, is biologically primary. They're different primary abilities. They're two primary abilities which are designed to allow us to obtain secondary information. And we can obtain biologically secondary information during problem solving. But there's a difference between those two techniques. Problem solving is slow and difficult. I'll explain more why it's difficult later. Difficult and clumsy. Getting information from other people is much more rapid, much more efficient. It's the best way of obtaining information, and it's the way we most commonly obtain biologically secondary information. So that immediately tells us something about instruction. We need to provide people with explicit information when we're providing instruction. Now, in the past, we used to do that automatically, but there was a move towards more problem-based instruction. And like I said, we can do it that way, but it's lengthy, it's slow, it's clumsy, it's not very effective. It's not a great way of learning. So the best way of learning is via explicit instruction, and I'll be coming back to that point several times during this talk. So, two ways of obtaining information: biologically secondary information, either by problem solving or by obtaining information from somebody else. Once we obtain information, it needs to be processed. And it's processed by a particular structure of our cognitive architecture, and that structure is called working memory. Working memory processes information which we obtain either by problem solving or by obtaining the information from somebody else. And when we're dealing with novel information, information which we're not familiar with, new information, working memory has two very important characteristics, and in some ways surprising characteristics. It's extremely limited in capacity. We can process maybe 2, 3, 4 elements of information at a time in working memory, no more. We can memorize no more than about 7, 5 to 9 elements of information. That's not process them, not compare them, not work on them in some way, just memorize them. No more than about 7. If it's more than 7, our working memory collapses. We're talking about novel information. Okay, so the important thing about working memory when dealing with novel information is it is extremely limited in capacity and duration. Oh, duration, I haven't talked about. Duration, we can hold information in working memory without rehearsal for about 18 seconds, no more. After 18 seconds, anything that's in working memory disappears unless you rehearse it. That's why if you look up a new telephone number and you have to dial that number, you can hold it for about 18 seconds. After that, unless you rehearse it, keep repeating it to yourself, it disappears. So working memory is extremely limited in duration and extremely limited in capacity. Now, in a classroom, students are being presented with novel information. It's exactly what they're being presented with. So we need to remember the person who's presenting the information, he or she is not using working memory. They're taking it from long-term memory, which I'm about to talk about. But the students, because the information is novel to them, it's new information, they have to deal with that restriction, those limitations of working memory. So working memory processes information, and in processing information, it sends the information, if it's information that we think we're going to need later on, it sends the information to long-term memory. So it processes the information, makes it ready for storage in long-term memory. Long-term memory is vastly different, very, very different to working memory. If long-term memory has any capacity limitations, we don't know what they are. We don't know what the limits are of long-term memory. It's enormous. And of course, most long-term memories stay with us for a very long time. None of this 18 seconds business, what's in long-term memory, it can stay with us for years. So it's a very large structure which can hold information for very long periods of time. Let me go on to the next basic aspect of human cognitive architecture, which in many ways is the most important. Once information has been stored in working memory, in long-term memory, it can be transferred back to working memory. But there's a difference. I indicated before that when we obtain information, new information from the external environment, working memory is extremely limited in capacity and duration. When we obtain information from long-term memory, those limitations disappear. we can transfer enormous amounts of information from long-term memory to working memory, and that information will simply stay in working memory. What that means is that what's in long-term memory transforms us. We become different people. It's a truism. It's true that we all feel that education transforms us. It's transformative. It changes us into different people. And the reason it does that is because of our ability to transfer huge amounts of information from long-term memory into working memory, and working memory can then indicate to us what we should do. In effect, what happens is we look at the environment and we say, okay, for this environment, this is the information in long-term memory I need to deal with this environment. We take the information from long-term memory, put it into working memory, and then working memory guides our activity. Give you an example of that. If you're a student learning elementary algebra for the first time, and somebody gives you a problem to solve, and the problem is A plus B all over C equals D. Solve for A. Make A the subject of the equation. Now, for somebody who's just beginning to learn algebra, that's a massively difficult task. They've got a whole lot of symbols. They've got to transform them in some way. They have to work out how to transform them and all of that. And this is all novel to them. They have to do all of that in a working memory, which is very, very limited in capacity and duration. It's a difficult task. In contrast, somebody who's learnt elementary algebra, if they're given an equation like A plus B all over C equals D, they simply take the entire equation from long-term memory into working memory along with its solution. They know immediately for equations of that sort, the first thing you do is you multiply out the denominator. The second thing you do is you subtract the addend. So you multiply by C, and then you subtract B, and that gives you the solution. And if you can hold that equation and its solution in long-term memory, and somebody who's learnt junior algebra can easily do that, it's a simple problem. It's not a simple problem for somebody who's just learning algebra. So the point I want to make is what's in long-term memory, it defines us. We are our long-term memories. If you think of yourself, what you're really thinking about is what's in your long-term memory. It's who you are. And it changes us. We can understand things, we can do things which we couldn't dream of couldn't dream of doing until we had learnt the various concepts and procedures. And by learnt, I meant transferred them to long-term memory. Long-term memory is extremely important. We tend to think of long-term memory as consisting of a whole series of unrelated bits of information. It's not. It's a whole series of highly connected information. The reason we think of it as being a lot of pieces of unrelated information is we are unconscious of what's in long-term memory for much of what's in long-term memory. Most of what's in long-term memory we're unconscious of. We're only conscious of what goes into working memory. If you want to know how to define consciousness, what is consciousness? It's what's in working memory. And it's only those aspects of what we see in the external environment and what we take from long-term memory that we're conscious of. And because we're only conscious of those bits of information, we tend to think, oh, long-term memory just consists of little bits of information. A lot of people say, I've got a really terrible memory. No normal human being has a terrible working memory. We have superb working memories because they're connected to long-term memory, and we have superb long-term memories. So that's the cognitive architecture that underlies cognitive load theory. That architecture has been used to generate a whole series of instructional effects. I can't adequately talk about those effects, but I'll talk about three of them, three of the more important ones. First one I'll talk about is the worked example effect. The worked example effect occurs when you run an experiment in which you give people a problem to solve, like the algebra problem I was just talking about. Give people a problem to solve. One group of people are given that problem to solve. Another group of people are given exactly the same problem, but they're shown the solution. The solution is written out. Okay, so they're shown A plus B all over C equals D, A plus B equals CD, A equals CD minus B. They're shown that solution written out. And instead of being asked to solve the problem, they're told, study the solution. So we run a randomized controlled experiment. One group are given a series of problems to solve. Another group are given the same problems with their solution, and they're asked to study them. Both groups are given the same amount of time, and then both groups are given a test. Let's see who's learned better. And the experimental results, which have been repeated on multiple occasions around the world, the group that's given the worked examples to study does better. Now, I don't find that surprising, but some people seem to feel that's surprising. Anyway, it's, the result is very easily obtained. So that's the expertise reversal effect. And you get that effect with novice students who've just started to learn. Now, let's assume students have learned this elementary algebra for a little while and they're getting a little bit better at it, and you run the experiment again. You're likely to find, yes, it's better to study the worked examples, but the difference between studying worked examples and solving problems is narrower. It's not as big. It's a smaller difference. Take the same people a little later, run the same experiment again, and the difference has disappeared. There's no difference anymore. Go a little later again, and you may find the people who are given the problems to solve now do better on the test than the people who are asked to study worked examples. So what's going on here? Well, that's a different effect. The previous effect I was talking about was the worked example effect. This is the expertise reversal effect. There are a lot of cognitive load effects, and for all of them, they all apply to novices. They apply to somebody who's just starting to learn. As people become more expert, the effects disappear and they start to reverse. Now, why do they reverse in this particular case? They reverse because of a third effect, and this is the last effect I'll talk about, called the redundancy effect. For somebody who is just learning algebra or science or learning how to write essays or learning whatever it is that they're being taught, they learn best by studying worked examples. As they become more expert, those worked examples become redundant. For most of this audience, if I show you a whole lot of worked examples in algebra, even if you're not somebody who's terribly interested in algebra, even if you're working in another area, because of the algebra that you remember from earlier on, you almost certainly will not gain anything by studying those worked examples. Practicing problems may be useful. Studying worked examples is no longer useful. Worked examples are redundant. The mental effort, the working memory effort you put into studying the worked examples is wasted. Let me briefly finish by saying a little bit more of the connection between the cognitive architecture that I was talking about earlier on and those three cognitive load theory effects. If you are new to algebra, having to solve a problem places a very heavy working memory load on you. It's a heavy cognitive load. Working memory load and cognitive load are the same terms. So you have a heavy cognitive load. It's difficult for you to manipulate all of those algebraic symbols in working memory. There's a heavy working memory load. Studying a worked example reduces that working memory load. And that's why for novices, worked examples are better than solving problems. For an expert, studying a worked example is a waste of time. You're using working memory to go over the solution to the problem, and you don't need to do that. You know how to solve that problem. You may need to practice it so that you can do it automatically, so you can do it without thought, but it's easy for you, and more of your working memory resources, more of your working memory resources are taken up by studying a worked example than are taken up by solving a problem. So there's a heavier load on working memory for an expert to study a worked example. They don't need to do it. Hence the redundancy effect. Redundancy effect works in a whole lot of other ways. When you're presenting information to people, make sure you don't present information they don't need. If you present information they don't need, they've got to process it in their limited working memory, and they won't be able to process the information they do need. Very often, the best instruction is the shortest instruction, not the longest instruction. That doesn't mean you shouldn't repeat things. It's a good idea for people to go over the same material, to have it repeated. But to have the same material presented in several different ways can overload working memory. The redundancy effect is one of the more important effects, which we tend to forget. There's you can see a lot of web pages try to teach people things. They'll give you a lot of information, and then they'll give a lot of other information, and they'll give you information that you don't need. They may include cartoons, they may include all sorts of things that you simply don't need, and people will learn less as a consequence. So beware of redundancy. Look, it's interesting. I often have arguments, as you might expect, with people who insist that they are teaching critical thinking skills or creativity. I normally respond by saying, okay, you know how to think critically. What critical thinking skills do you use yourself? What are they? How did you learn them? Who taught them to you? Describe them to me. The only response I get is complete silence. There are none. That's not true. There are critical thinking skills, but they're biologically primary. Critical thinking skills are skills which we acquire automatically. And we only can use critical thinking in areas where we have a lot of knowledge. I can think critically in my own area because I've got a lot of knowledge in the area. If somebody says something which contradicts what I know to be false, contradicts what I know to be true, I can immediately use critical thinking and say, oh no, look, that's wrong. Here's the data, here's the evidence that that's wrong. I can't do that in areas where I'm for which I'm unfamiliar. I can only do it in areas where I'm highly familiar. So if you want to teach somebody critical thinking skills, you can do it by teaching them domain-specific knowledge. If they've got domain-specific knowledge, they will have critical thinking skills in the area in which you're asking them to think. If they don't have domain knowledge, we cannot think critically in areas where we don't have domain knowledge. It's not enough to say, yes, we can always obtain that information. You know, if it's an arithmetic thing, we can go to a calculator. If it's some other information, we can go to Google. It doesn't work because we need to be able to think, and we can't think when we don't have knowledge. I'll give you an example that, you know, keeps happening in when I go shopping. I go to the person at the checkout, and I give them money and I expect change. They can't get the change without going to their calculator and working it out. I know the change immediately because I know how to do mental arithmetic. Being very old, I was taught differently, and I was taught to do mental arithmetic. You simply can't, whenever you go shopping, pull out a calculator and start working things out. People just don't do that. It's too difficult. It's difficult to, it's much easier if you actually understand, okay, this item costs $5.60 and I need 3 of them. How much money do I need? It's a lot easier to do it in your head. So there are things we simply can't rely on machinery to do our thinking for us. It's very early now, but it may require changes in the sense that we may need many, many more examinations and many, many fewer assignments, unless we can work out whether an assignment comes from ChatGPT or somewhere else. We're going to have a problem with assignments. Can I emphasize, the reason those artificial programs now work, the old artificial programs didn't work properly, and they didn't work properly because they didn't have a knowledge base. The new ones work because they can acquire an enormous knowledge base easily and quickly. They work because they have a knowledge base. Intelligence means having knowledge. You don't have knowledge in long... There's no such thing as a person who is very intelligent and doesn't have knowledge. Intelligence comes from knowledge. Right. It's one of the reasons why we know that if you use normal intelligence tests, they show that the population is getting more and more intelligent. Well, they are becoming more and more intelligent, and they're becoming more and more intelligent because they have more and more knowledge. Gamification, it's not, it's partly emotion, but it's really using problem solving. Right. I really don't think it's a great way of learning because it places that heavy emphasis on problem solving. But emotion has effects on working memory. If you're emotional, whatever's driving your emotion, you're thinking about it. Now, working memory is limited in capacity and duration. If you're using working memory resources to think about something other than what you're supposed to be learning, you're not going to learn. So we do have some experiments indicating that if somebody is emotional, they don't learn as well than if they're not emotional, because emotion takes up working memory. Emotion simply means you are running, you've had a argument with another person, and it was an emotional argument, and you keep thinking about that argument. Now, you're not learning when that's happening. And you're not learning because your working memory is concerned with the argument you had because it was emotional. Right. So it can be a problem. It interferes with learning, yeah. We are not terribly good at transferring knowledge. The only way we can transfer knowledge is if we can actually see, okay, this problem, which is solved in this particular way, is really the same as this other problem. This other problem looks different, but it's really the same. From the data we have, the best way of transferring knowledge is to ensure that your initial knowledge, that you really, really know the area well. If you know the area well, you can transfer it. Let me give you an example. You learn, let's go back to algebra. Let's take let's go back to the equation I was talking about before. A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A. If you look at that equation and you decide, oh, look, I think I have to multiply out the denominator. And if you're sitting there thinking, oh, how do I multiply out a denominator again? Oh, I know this is what I do to multiply out a denominator. You can't transfer anything. There'll be no transfer. You get transfer when you know the material extremely well. When you know it well, you can transfer it to a new situation. You can recognize a new situation. If you don't know it well, if you've got to think about, oh, how do I do this? How do I solve the old problem? If you're still thinking about how to solve the old problem, you're not going to be able to solve the new problem. So people can transfer knowledge if they really know the area well, providing they can use the information in automatic form without having to worry about working memory, because they know automatically, this is how I do that. All right, I see how it applies to this new problem. You can only do that if you really know it well.
Yeah. So it depends on domain-specific knowledge.
It depends on domain-specific knowledge. There's no way of teaching people how to transfer knowledge in
general,
entirely different ways, entirely different areas. You can transfer knowledge in an area where you have a lot of domain-specific knowledge. No domain-specific knowledge, you can't transfer anything.